I get a message, "Hey beautiful, when are we meeting up?" I'm shocked I don't know anyone. I check his phone. My brother has been pretending to be me on Tinder, Instagram, and dating sites for years. You know that feeling when your whole world just tilts sideways? That's exactly what happened to me last Tuesday when my phone buzzed with a text from a random number. The message was so casual, so familiar, like we'd been talking for months. But I had absolutely no idea who this person was. At first, I thought it was just another spam message or someone texting the wrong number. I get those sometimes, and usually I just ignore them. But something about the tone made me pause. This wasn't a generic, "Hey baby" message. This person mentioned specific things, like how I supposedly loved hiking on weekends and how I told them about my job at the local coffee shop. Except I hate hiking and I've never worked at a coffee shop in my life. My stomach started doing these weird little flips as more messages came in throughout the day. Different numbers, different people, but all with this same strange familiarity. One person asked about our date last weekend, a date I definitely didn't go on. Another wanted to know if I was still coming to some party I'd never heard of. It was like living in the Twilight Zone. I started screenshotting everything, trying to make sense of it all. The messages were getting more frequent, and some of them were getting pretty intimate. People were sending me photos, sharing personal stories, acting like we had these deep connections. My hands were literally shaking as I scrolled through message after message from complete strangers who seemed to know me better than I knew myself. That evening I was pacing around my apartment, phone clutched in my hand, when my brother stopped by. He does this thing where he just shows up unannounced, usually when he needs something or wants to raid my fridge. He walked in like nothing was wrong, grabbed a beer, and plopped down on my couch like he owned the place. I was so worked up that I just started rambling about the weird messages, showing him screenshot after screenshot. I expected him to be concerned, maybe suggest I change my number or something. Instead, he got this really strange look on his face. His whole body went stiff and he started fumbling with his phone, trying to hide the screen from me. That's when something clicked. Call it sister's intuition or whatever, but I just knew. Without thinking, I lunged for his phone. We ended up in this ridiculous wrestling match over it. Both of us sprawled across my coffee table, knocking over magazines and my favorite mug in the process. When I finally got the phone away from him, what I saw made my blood run cold. Multiple dating apps, all with my photos. Instagram accounts using my name and pictures. Even some weird dating websites I'd never heard of. And the messages, oh God, the messages. Hundreds of conversations with different people, all pretending to be me. My brother just sat there on the floor looking like a kid who'd been caught stealing from the cookie jar. But this wasn't some harmless prank. This was my life, my identity, my face being used to talk to strangers about things I'd never said, promising meetings I'd never agreed to. The worst part was how good he was at it. Reading through the conversations, he created this whole persona for me. This version of me was outgoing and flirty, someone who loved adventure and was always up for spontaneous plans. He'd given me hobbies I didn't have, a job I'd never worked, even fake memories and stories about our childhood that weren't true. I felt sick. Actually physically nauseous. Here I was, thinking I was losing my mind because of these random messages, and it turns out my own brother had been living some weird double life as me for months, maybe even years. He finally started talking and it all came pouring out. Apparently it started small, just using my photos on one dating app because he was too insecure to use his own. But then people started responding, wanting to meet up, and instead of coming clean, he just kept digging deeper. He created more accounts, more elaborate stories, more versions of me. The kicker? He'd actually met some of these people in real life. He'd show up to dates pretending to be me, making up excuses about why I looked different, or claiming I'd had some kind of makeover. Some people believed it. Others didn't, but by then he was in too deep to stop. I couldn't even process it all. My brain just kept jumping from one horrifying detail to another. There were people out there who thought they'd been dating me, kissing me, maybe even sleeping with me. There were others who probably thought I was some kind of catfish or scammer. My reputation, my safety, my entire sense of self, all of it had been compromised without me even knowing. Update 1, the aftermath gets worse. So it's been about a week since I discovered what my brother had been doing, and honestly, I thought the initial shock was the worst part. I was so wrong. I spent the entire next day going through every single account he'd created. The scope of it was mind-boggling. We're not talking about just a couple of dating profiles here. He'd created versions of me on platforms I didn't even know existed. There were accounts on hiking forums where I had been planning group trips. Food blogs where I had been sharing recipes in restaurant reviews. Even some kind of book club thing where I had apparently been recommending romance novels for months. But the dating stuff was definitely the most disturbing. I found conversations going back almost 2 years. 2 years of my brother pretending to be me, flirting with strangers, making plans, creating relationships. Some of these conversations were so detailed and intimate that I felt like I was reading someone else's diary. Except it was supposed to be my diary, my life, my thoughts and feelings. The messages on my actual phone kept coming too. More and more people reaching out, confused about why I was suddenly acting different or not responding to their messages. One guy sent me this long, heartbroken text about how our relationship had meant everything to him and he couldn't understand why I was being so cold. Another person was angry, accusing me of being a fake because I didn't remember conversations we'd supposedly had. I tried explaining to a few of them what had happened, but honestly, how do you even begin to explain something like this? Hi, sorry, my brother has been pretending to be me online for 2 years. Sounds completely insane. Most people either didn't believe me or just stopped responding altogether. The worst was this one woman who'd apparently become really close friends with fake me. She'd been confiding in me about her divorce, her struggles with her kids, her financial problems. She trusted this version of me with her deepest secrets, and now she felt completely betrayed. I couldn't blame her. If I were in her shoes, I'd probably feel the same way. My brother kept trying to apologize, but his apologies felt so hollow. He'd show up at my apartment with flowers or coffee, acting like this was some minor mistake he could fix with grand gestures. He kept saying things like, I never meant for it to get this big, and I was just lonely, and I thought it was harmless. But how is identity theft harmless? How is manipulating people's emotions harmless? The thing that really got to me was how he'd been studying me, analyzing my personality and behavior to make his fake versions more convincing. He knew exactly which photos of me got the most attention online. He'd memorized my mannerisms, my speech patterns, even little quirks I didn't realize I had. It felt like being dissected by someone I trusted my whole life. I started noticing things differently too. Like how he'd sometimes make comments about my appearance or suggest I try new things. Now I wondered if he was gathering material for his fake accounts. Had he been taking mental notes every time I told him about my day, filing away details to use later in his elaborate charade? The paranoia was eating me alive. I'd catch myself checking over my shoulder when I was out, wondering if someone might recognize me as the person they'd been talking to online. I changed all my social media settings to private, deleted half my photos, even considered changing my phone number. But none of that could undo what had already been done. Work became weird too. I kept wondering if any of my coworkers had somehow stumbled across one of the fake accounts. Every time someone looked at me strangely or made a random comment, I'd panic, thinking they'd discovered my brother's secret life. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, analyzing every conversation for signs that someone knew something I didn't. The hardest part was dealing with my family. My parents had no idea what was going on and I couldn't figure out how to tell them. How do you explain to your parents that one of their children has been systematically impersonating the other for years? They'd always seen us as this close-knit sibling pair, and I didn't want to destroy that image, but I also couldn't pretend everything was normal. My brother kept begging me not to tell them, promising he'd delete everything and never do it again. But the damage was already done. There were people out there who'd been hurt, confused, manipulated. There were relationships that had been built on lies, emotions that had been played with, trust that had been completely shattered. I felt responsible somehow, even though I knew rationally that I hadn't done anything wrong. But these people had been hurt by someone using my face, my name, my identity. In their minds, I was the one who'd betrayed them, lied to them, played with their feelings. That guilt was suffocating. Update 2. Confronting the deeper truth. It's been almost a month now, and I'm finally starting to understand the full extent of what my brother did. But more importantly, I'm starting to understand why he did it, and that's somehow even more disturbing than the original betrayal. After weeks of him dodging my questions and giving me these surface-level apologies, I finally cornered him at our parents' house during Sunday dinner. I told him we needed to talk, really talk, and if he didn't start telling me the truth, I was going to tell our parents everything. That's when the Real story came out, and it was so much worse than I'd imagined. It turns out this whole thing started in high school, not just 2 years ago like I thought. Remember how he was always the shy one, the awkward one who had trouble making friends? Well, apparently he'd been using my photos and pretending to be me online since we were teenagers. At first, it was just to feel popular, to experience what it was like to have people actually want to talk to him. But as we got older, it evolved into something much more twisted. He wasn't just catfishing random people for attention. He was living out this elaborate fantasy life where he got to be the confident, attractive, socially successful version of himself that he'd always wanted to be. Except he was doing it by literally stealing my identity and my life. The dating apps were just the latest evolution of something that had been going on for over a decade. He'd been creating fake social media accounts, fake email addresses, even fake LinkedIn profiles using my information. He'd been applying for jobs as me, joining online communities as me, even signing up for classes and workshops using my name. Some of this stuff had real-world consequences that I'm only now discovering. There's apparently a pottery class across town where I signed up but never showed up, and they've been sending increasingly annoyed emails about missed sessions and unpaid fees. There's a gym membership in my name that I never authorized, and they've been trying to collect on overdue payments. There are even library fines in my name from books I never checked out. But the emotional manipulation was the worst part. My brother had been using my identity to form genuine connections with people, letting them pour their hearts out to fake me, offering fake comfort and fake friendship. Some of these people had been talking to me for years, sharing their deepest fears and dreams with someone who was essentially a fiction. One conversation I found was with this elderly man whose wife had recently died. He'd been reaching out to me almost daily, talking about his grief, his loneliness, how much it meant to have someone young and kind to talk to. My brother had been responding with these thoughtful, caring messages, pretending to care about this man's pain while simultaneously exploiting it for his own emotional needs. Another was with a teenage girl who was struggling with bullying at school. She'd found one of the fake accounts and started messaging me for advice and support. My brother had been giving her pep talks, helping her through panic attacks, even talking her through some really dark moments. This girl genuinely believed she had this older sister figure looking out for her, when in reality she'd been pouring her heart out to a complete stranger who was using her vulnerability for his own twisted purposes. The more I read, the more disgusted I became. Not just with my brother, but with myself for not seeing this sooner. There had been signs, little things that didn't quite add up. Times when people would mention seeing me places I'd never been or reference conversations I didn't remember having. I'd always chalked it up to mistaken identity or people confusing me with someone else. But the biggest revelation was why he'd chosen to use my identity specifically. It wasn't just convenience or opportunity. My brother admitted that he'd always been jealous of me, not just for my looks but for my personality, my confidence, my ability to connect with people easily. By pretending to be me, he got to experience what it felt like to be the person he'd always wished he could be. That hit me harder than anything else. My own brother, someone I'd loved and supported my entire life, had been secretly resenting me for years. Every compliment I'd ever received, every friendship I'd formed, every romantic relationship I'd had, he'd been watching it all with envy, wishing he could have what I had. The worst part was realizing how this had affected his real personality over the years. He'd become increasingly withdrawn and antisocial, not because he was naturally introverted, but because he was getting all his social needs met through these fake online personas. Why bother developing real social skills when you could just steal someone else's identity and coast on their reputation? I finally understood why he'd never seemed to have any real ambition or direction in his life. Why would he need to work on himself when he could just pretend to be me whenever he wanted to feel successful or attractive or interesting? The fake accounts had become a crutch that prevented him from growing as a person. Now I was faced with this impossible situation. I had dozens of people who'd been emotionally manipulated and deceived, some of them for years. I had financial and legal complications from accounts and memberships opened in my name. I had my own reputation and safety to think about. But I also had a brother who was clearly struggling with some deep psychological issues. The family dinner that night was tense. I could see my parents noticing that something was off between us, but I still couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How do you explain to your parents that their son has been living a double life as their daughter for over a decade? How do you tell them that everything they thought they knew about their family dynamic was built on lies and deception? My brother kept giving me these pleading looks across the dinner table, silently begging me not to say anything. But I was done protecting him. Done making excuses for him. Done pretending everything was fine when my entire sense of self had been violated in the most fundamental way possible. Final update, moving forward. 2 months have passed since I discovered my brother's elaborate deception, and I can honestly say it's been the most challenging period of my life. But I've also learned things about myself, my family, and the nature of identity that I never expected to discover. The first major decision I made was to tell my parents everything. I couldn't keep carrying this secret, and frankly, I realized that my brother needed more help than I could provide. The conversation was every bit as difficult as I'd anticipated. My mom cried. My dad got angry, then confused, then angry again. They kept asking questions I couldn't answer, like how long I'd known and why I hadn't told them sooner. But telling them was the right choice. They immediately stepped in and got my brother into intensive counseling, not the kind I'd been avoiding mentioning, but actual family intervention work. They also helped me navigate some of the legal and financial complications that had emerged from his identity theft. The financial stuff was actually easier to resolve than I'd expected. Most of the companies were surprisingly understanding when I explained the situation and provided police reports. The gym membership was canceled, the pottery studio waived their fees, and the library was actually kind of sweet about the whole thing once they understood what had happened. But dealing with all the people he'd been talking to online was much more complicated. I spent weeks reaching out to as many as I could find, trying to explain what had happened. Some people were understanding and grateful that I'd taken the time to tell them the truth. Others were angry, hurt, or simply didn't believe me. A few just disappeared, probably too embarrassed or confused to continue any kind of contact. The elderly man whose wife had died was particularly heartbreaking. When I called him to explain that the person he'd been talking to wasn't real, he was devastated all over again. He'd formed this genuine attachment to who he thought I was, and losing that connection felt like another death to him. I ended up staying on the phone with him for over 2 hours that day, just letting him process his feelings about being deceived during such a vulnerable time. The teenage girl was easier to help, thankfully. She was upset at first, but when I explained that she'd been talking to my troubled brother rather than some malicious stranger, she actually seemed relieved. I connected her with some real resources for dealing with bullying and gave her my actual contact information in case she ever needed someone to talk to. She's doing much better now from what I can tell. But the strangest part of this whole experience has been rediscovering my own identity. For months after finding out what my brother had done, I felt like I didn't know who I really was anymore. He created all these versions of me that were similar enough to be believable but different enough to feel foreign. I started questioning my own personality, wondering if the confident, outgoing person I thought I was had somehow been influenced by seeing his interpretation of me. I went through this phase where I was almost afraid to be myself online or in public. What if people expected me to be like one of his fake versions? What if I disappointed them by being my real self instead of the fantasy he'd created? I found myself second-guessing every social interaction, wondering if I was being authentic or just performing some version of myself that I thought other people wanted to see. But gradually I started to reclaim my sense of self. I realized that my brother's fake versions of me were actually based on who I really am. He just amplified certain traits and suppressed others to create these idealized personas. The real me was still there underneath all the confusion and self-doubt. I also started to understand my brother better, though that didn't make me any less angry about what he'd done. Through family sessions and long, difficult conversations, I learned that his obsession with my identity had started much earlier than I'd realized. He'd been comparing himself to me since we were little kids, feeling like he was always in my shadow, always the less popular, less confident, less successful sibling. What he'd done was inexcusable, but I could finally see the pain and insecurity that had driven him to such extreme measures. He hadn't just been stealing my identity for fun or attention, he'd been desperately trying to escape from his own sense of inadequacy and failure. The hardest part was learning to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying all that anger and resentment was poisoning my own life. It took months of work, both individual reflection and family conversations, but I eventually reached a point where I could separate the person he was from the horrible things he'd done. My brother has made significant changes in his life. He deleted all the fake accounts, closed all the fraudulent memberships, and reached out to apologize to as many people as he could find. He's been working on developing his own identity and interests rather than living vicariously through mine. It's been slow progress, and there are still days when I wonder if he truly understands the full impact of what he did, but he's trying. Our relationship will never be the same as it was before. I don't think I could ever trust him completely again, and there's always going to be this part of me that wonders what else he might be hiding. But we're slowly building something new, something more honest and real than what we had before. I've also become much more aware of my online presence and digital security. I regularly monitor my accounts, check for unauthorized access, and keep my personal information much more private than I used to. It's sad that I have to live with this level of vigilance, but it's a small price to pay for peace of mind. The experience has changed how I think about identity and authenticity in general. We live in this world where so much of our social interaction happens online, where it's easy to curate and manipulate our self-presentation. My brother's deception was an extreme example, but it made me realize how much of our digital selves are already performance to some degree. I'm more careful now about the connections I form online, more skeptical of people who seem too good to be true, more aware of the ways that technology can be used to manipulate and deceive. But I'm also more appreciative of genuine human connection when I find it. Looking back, I think the most important thing I learned is that you can't control how other people see you or what they do with your image, but you can control how you respond when your boundaries are violated. I could have let my brother's betrayal destroy my trust in everyone, make me paranoid and isolated. Instead, I chose to use it as an opportunity to become stronger, more self-aware, and more intentional about the relationships in my life. It's been 6 months now since I first got that confusing text message that started this whole nightmare. My brother is doing better, my family is slowly healing, and I'm learning to trust my own instincts again. There are still moments when I wonder what other secrets might be lurking in the people closest to me, but mostly I'm focused on moving forward and building a life that's authentically mine. The strangers who were hurt by my brother's deception deserved better, and I wish I could undo all the pain and confusion he caused. But I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to be the kind of person who would never use someone else's vulnerability for my own benefit, and hope that the real connections I form going forward will be strong enough to withstand whatever challenges come next.